Gabrielle didn't hesitate. She turned the key, pushed the cockpit door open, and stepped inside. Captain Hayes barely glanced at her. His grip on the controls was too relaxed, too casual for someone supposedly handling an emergency diversion. "You really think you're in charge here?" His smirk was slow, condescending. Gabrielle didn't flinch. She stepped forward, voice calm but laced with steel. "Captain Hayes, you are relieved of duty. Effective immediately." His smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. You are no longer in control of this aircraft. Step away from the controls." Hayes's jaw clenched. "You don't have the authority." "I have every authority," she cut in smoothly. "This is my aircraft, my flight crew, and my name on the title. You locked me out of my own cockpit. You ignored my directives. You deliberately stalled this flight. And now you're done." The tension in the cockpit thickened. Gabrielle could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. "You really think you can just fire me?" Hayes scoffed, but there was something else in his voice now. Doubt. Gabrielle stepped even closer. Her presence undeniable, her power absolute. "Oh, I'm not thinking. I know. You're finished. The moment this plane lands, security will be waiting. You will be escorted off and blacklisted from every private aviation firm that matters." Hayes's nostrils flared, his hands curled into fists. But then he saw it. The unwavering certainty in her eyes, the realization that he had lost. Slowly, he let go of the controls. Gabrielle didn't wait for another word. She turned to Sophia, her new chief pilot. "Take us to London, no more delays." As the flight path corrected and the engines hummed with renewed purpose, Gabrielle exhaled, her grip on control fully restored. They had underestimated her. They had tried to take her power, and they had failed. As she walked out of the cockpit, the weight of the moment settled over everyone watching. Karen's face had gone pale. Jason and Lillian stood frozen, and Sophia, for the first time, stood tall. Gabrielle adjusted her cuff, her voice unwavering as she gave her final command. "Hayes is done, and anyone who thinks like him, you're next." But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. The black SUV glided smoothly toward the private terminal of Miami Executive Airport, its polished exterior reflecting the early morning glow. Inside, Gabrielle Lawson sat poised, her fingers drumming lightly against the leather armrest, her mind already racing through the logistics of the day ahead. Dressed in a tailored navy pool power suit that accentuated both her authority and her sharp sense of style, she exuded the quiet confidence of a woman who had built an empire from the ground up. At 38, she was the CEO of Lawson Dynamics, a billion-dollar tech firm that dominated the AI industry, and today, she was set to fly to London for a high-stakes negotiation that could change the course of her company's future. Yet before she could even reach her jet, she would have to deal with the all-too-familiar dance of doubt and suspicion that came with being a black woman in spaces where few expected her to belong. As the wrought iron gates of the private terminal loomed ahead, Eddie, her longtime chauffeur, slowed to a stop. Standing at the entrance was a burly security guard, his arms crossed over his chest, his stance radiating skepticism. The name stitched onto his uniform read Frank, but it was the look in his eyes that caught Gabrielle's attention, a mixture of mild amusement and ingrained condescension. He leaned down toward the driver's window, his mouth curling into a smirk as he gave Eddie a quick glance before shifting his gaze to Gabrielle in the back seat. "You sure you're in the right place, ma'am?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular tone, the one that wasn't a question but a challenge. Gabrielle didn't flinch. She'd been here before. Boardrooms, gala events, exclusive clubs. The pattern was always the same. The moment of hesitation, the unspoken doubt, the assumption that she was someone's assistant, someone's plus one, someone other than the boss. She held Frank's gaze, her expression unwavering as she replied, "I don't think. I know. That's my jet." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, gone just as quickly as it appeared. He let out a small, dismissive chuckle, shaking his head slightly as if he found the whole situation amusing. "Right?" he muttered, pulling out his clipboard, taking his time as he flipped through the pages. Gabrielle could see the game he was playing. Draw it out, make her wait, establish control. It was a tired tactic, but she had neither the time nor the patience for it. From the front seat, Eddie cleared his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "We're on a schedule," he said evenly, though Gabrielle caught the slight edge in his voice. Eddie had worked for her long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, but he also knew she didn't need anyone fighting her battles. Frank didn't look up, still skimming the documents, still stalling. "I haven't seen your name on the regular roster," he said, glancing back at Gabrielle as if expecting her to explain herself. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained smooth. "That's because I bought the jet last month. Check again." "Lawson, Hangar 9. For a second, she thought he might push back, might press the moment just a little further to see if she'd snap. But something in her expression must have warned him not to. With an exaggerated sigh, he finally stepped back and spoke into his radio. A few seconds later, the gates began to creak open, the heavy metal groaning against its own weight. As the SUV rolled forward, Gabrielle exhaled sharply, a controlled release of the tension she refused to let show. This wasn't the first time she had to prove she belonged. It wouldn't be the last. But today, she was in no mood to entertain anyone's doubt. Not from a security guard, not from her flight crew, not from anyone. The SUV came to a smooth stop just outside Hangar 9, and Gabrielle's eyes locked onto the sleek, polished body of her Gulfstream G700, its silver exterior gleaming under the early morning sun. Even now, weeks after purchasing it, there was still something surreal about owning a jet of this caliber. A symbol of her relentless ambition, her sacrifices, and her refusal to be boxed in by anyone's expectations. But whatever sense of satisfaction she might have felt was immediately dulled by the sight of the crew clustered near the air stairs, their hushed conversation stopping the moment her door opened. She stepped out, adjusting the cuff of her suit, her heels clicking against the tarmac with a sharp finality. Eddie remained by the SUV, arms folded, watching. Gabrielle didn't need to look at him to know he was ready to step in if necessary, but she had no intention of letting anyone think she needed backup. She approached with her usual commanding stride, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Hesitation, skepticism, something just shy of outright defiance. Captain Richard Hayes, standing front and center, didn't move, arms crossed over his broad chest, aviator sunglasses shielding his eyes. He looked more like a bouncer than a pilot. His stance was stiff, not out of respect but challenge, as if he were daring her to say something first. His reputation preceded him. Ex-military, deeply traditional, the kind of man who thrived in male-dominated spaces and didn't take kindly to change. To his left, co-pilot Sofia Martinez stood with her hands neatly clasped in front of her gaze flicking between Gabrielle and Hayes like she could already sense the storm brewing but wasn't quite ready to get caught in it. Behind them, lead flight attendant Karen Whitmore wore a smirk that set Gabrielle's teeth on edge, her arms crossed in a near mirror of Hayes, exuding an almost performative sense of doubt. Jason and Lillian, the two junior attendants, hung back, clearly uneasy but silent, their expressions careful, neutral, but not interfering. Then Karen tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes as she said, "Oh, we were expecting a Mr. Lawson." Gabrielle didn't blink, didn't even allow her expression to shift, but she felt the way the air tightened around them, as if the moment itself had dared her to react. Her voice was smooth, unhurried, but edged with steel as she met Karen's gaze head-on. "Well, congratulations. You've met me instead." The smirk faltered just a fraction before Karen quickly recovered, exchanging a glance with Captain Hayes, who exhaled sharply through his nose as if barely holding back his irritation. Gabrielle let her eyes sweep over the crew, noting every flicker of hesitation, every unspoken question written across their faces. They didn't believe she was the owner. They weren't convinced. She clenched her jaw. Not out of anger. Anger was easy, predictable, exactly what people like this expected. but out of the sheer exhaustion of having to do this again and again. In boardrooms, in luxury hotels, in places she had more than earned the right to be, and now, even here, on the tarmac of a jet she owned, the same quiet, insidious battle was unfolding in real time. It was going to be one of those days. Gabrielle moved toward the air stairs, her heels clicking with steady precision against the pavement as she approached the jet that bore her name on the registration. The air was humid, thick with the lingering warmth of the Miami morning, but the tension rolling off the crew in front of her was even heavier. She reached for the railing, placing one foot on the first step, then the second. Then a sickening jolt shot through her body as the step beneath her gave way, dropping just enough to throw her off balance. Her grip on the railing tightened instinctively as she stumbled, her pulse spiking. For a fraction of a second, gravity threatened to betray her, and in that moment, a dozen calculations fired through her mind. If she fell, she'd hit the pavement hard. She could twist an ankle. Worse, slam her head against the metal stairs. The thought was gone as quickly as it came, drowned out by the sharp inhale she took as she righted herself, regaining control. Sophia was the first to react, stepping forward with real concern in her voice. "Are you okay?" she asked, eyes flicking between Gabrielle and the unstable step. But Captain Hayes, he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't so much as shift his weight. Instead, he just stood there, arms crossed, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he found the whole thing amusing. Gabrielle's heart pounded in her ears, not from fear, but from something colder, something sharper. Was that an accident? Or a warning? Her gaze snapped to Karen, who was watching the scene unfold with an expression that teetered between fake concern and veiled amusement. Jason and Lillian, the younger flight attendants, looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in place. But Gabrielle wasn't interested in the ones pretending they had nothing to do with it. She was focused on the ones who didn't look surprised. She took a slow, measured breath, schooling her expression into something unreadable. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction, wouldn't give them even the smallest hint that they'd rattled her. Instead, she tested the step cautiously before climbing the rest of the way, her movements precise, controlled. Behind her, one of the ground crew members muttered something under his breath before bending down to examine the faulty step. A moment later, he called out, "Looks like the side latch wasn't secured properly." Sophia exhaled in what sounded like relief, but Gabrielle's fingers curled tightly around the strap of her handbag. Was it really just an oversight, or had someone made sure this would be the first message she received the moment she stepped onto her own plane? The latch was quickly hammered back into place, but her trust was already shaken. Gabrielle stepped into the cabin, the scent of polished leather and recirculated air greeting her. The interior was pristine, just as she had designed it. Cream-colored leather seats, mahogany accents, a workspace fitted with top-tier tech. But something felt off. The usual warmth of a private flight, the subtle touches of service meant to make the experience effortless, were missing. No fresh coffee waiting, no chilled water, no sign that anyone had bothered to prepare for her arrival. The air held an unmistakable chill, not from the temperature, but from the people inside it. She set her bag down on the nearest seat, scanning the space as she shrugged off her jacket. She wasn't imagining it. The tension was real. Sophia entered behind her, her gaze flicking toward the galley before she quickly looked away, as if she didn't want to be associated with whatever was coming next. Gabrielle straightened, glancing toward the small service counter near the entry, where Karen stood with a clipboard, flipping through the flight manifest. Karen barely looked up. "Can I get you anything, Miss Lawson?" she asked, her tone polite but flat, as if this were a formality rather than actual service. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed slightly. "Black coffee, no sugar." Karen gave a thin-lipped smile, but she didn't move, just tapped the edge of her clipboard, flipping a page lazily. "Ah, right, so, funny thing, we weren't sure you'd be flying today." Gabrielle stilled. "Excuse me?" Karen turned the clipboard around, her nails clicking against the page as she tapped the manifest. The flight log listed a Mr. Lawson as the principal passenger, so you can imagine our confusion. For a long, taut second, the only sound in the cabin was the hum of the jet's systems. Gabrielle's pulse ticked once, slow and deliberate, as she stared at the document in front of her. A mistake? Or an insult? Her eyes lifted, locking onto Karen's with quiet precision. "Is that so?" Karen shrugged. "We were expecting—" She let the sentence hang, the subtext loud and clear. Gabrielle didn't blink. And yet, here I am. Karen's lips twitched, something smug hidden just beneath the surface. "Well, paperwork can be a mess, you know. The agency that handles these things must have gotten their wires crossed. We didn't want to assume." Gabrielle's fingers curled against the leather seat. Didn't want to assume. Right. That excuse had been used in 100 different places, 100 different ways, in meetings where her authority was questioned, in boardrooms where people mistook her for an assistant. Now, here, on her own damn jet. She inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. They were playing games, but she wouldn't bite. She glanced toward the cockpit, where Captain Hayes still hadn't bothered to make an appearance. His silence spoke volumes. Karen tilted her head slightly, waiting, as if expecting Gabrielle to argue. Instead, Gabrielle smiled, slow and razor-sharp. "Then I suggest you update the manifest, unless you'd like to take this up with my legal team." Karen's smirk faltered just slightly before she turned back toward the galley, her voice overly chipper. "I'll see what I can do about that coffee." Gabrielle sank into her seat, exhaling silently. So this is how they wanted to play it. Gabrielle had barely settled into her seat, her laptop open as she reviewed the latest reports on the London deal, when the intercom crackled to life. Captain Hayes' voice came through, flat, almost bored, as if he were reading off a script rather than making a major announcement. "Due to an unexpected request, we are diverting to Bermuda for an emergency safety check." Her fingers froze over the keyboard. "What?" She straightened immediately, her mind racing. There had been no discussion, no prior notice, no request from her office. A diversion meant wasted time, delays, explanations she didn't owe anyone. More than that, it meant control was slipping away from her. She slammed the laptop shut and was on her feet in seconds, moving down the aisle with quick, deliberate strides. Jason and Lillian looked up as she passed, their expressions shifting from neutral professionalism to barely concealed worry. Karen, stationed near the galley, had the audacity to look amused, as if she had been expecting this exact reaction. Gabrielle didn't break her pace. She reached the cockpit door and turned the handle. Lock! Her stomach tightened. She knocked once, firm and authoritative. No response. She knocked again, harder. "Captain Hayes," she said, voice sharp, controlled. "Open the door." Silence. The blood in her veins turned to ice. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't normal. A locked cockpit wasn't unusual during critical moments of flight, but right now, they were at cruising altitude, no turbulence, no emergency. There was no reason for him to shut her out, unless he wanted her out of the equation. She turned, scanning the cabin. Sophia stood near the front, half hidden by the partition, her face tight with unease. Their eyes met, and in that moment Gabrielle saw it. Hesitation, uncertainty, something unspoken but dangerously close to confirmation. Sophia knew? Gabrielle moved toward her with quiet, controlled fury. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Sophia hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door as if weighing the risk. She exhaled, dropping her voice to a whisper. "I don't know why we're diverting. There's no mechanical issue. No one reported anything before takeoff." Gabrielle's pulse pounded. "And why is the cockpit locked?" Sophia swallowed. "Because he doesn't want you in there." Gabrielle inhaled sharply, her entire body going rigid. "Are they trying to remove me from my own plane?" Sophia's hesitation stretched long enough that Gabrielle almost snapped at her, but then, with a sharp exhale, the co-pilot reached into her pocket and pulled out a small ring of keys. She glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Gabrielle, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't be doing this." Gabrielle didn't blink. "Then don't waste time thinking about it. Give me the key." Sophia pressed the cold metal into Gabrielle's palm, her hand trembling slightly before she pulled away, stepping back as if distancing herself from whatever was about to happen. Gabrielle didn't hesitate. She slid the key into the lock and turned it with a quick, decisive movement. The door clicked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Captain Hayes didn't flinch, didn't even glance back as she entered. He sat comfortably in the left seat, his hands resting lazily on the controls, posture too relaxed for someone supposedly handling an emergency diversion. The overhead panels blinked with soft lights, the hum of the jet's systems filling the air. Gabrielle's gaze flicked to the co-pilot's seat. It was empty. Sophia had abandoned her post. Hayes finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence, and then, he smirked. "You really think you're in charge here?" he asked, his voice as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Gabrielle's nails dug into her palm. "You locked the cockpit door and announced an unauthorized diversion. Explain." Hayes exhaled as if she were an annoyance rather than the person signing his paycheck. "Relax. It's just a precaution." "Caution for what?" His smirk widened. "Let's just say, certain passengers cause turbulence long before the plane ever hits it." Her pulse hammered, but she refused to react. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to snap, to yell, to make this personal. But Gabrielle played chess, not checkers. She inhaled, slow and steady, before her voice dropped to something cold and sharp. "If you land this plane anywhere but London, you'll never fly for another private owner again." Hayes chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You think I care about your threats?" Gabrielle leaned forward slightly, voice dropping even lower. "It's not a threat, it's a guarantee." The smirk faltered, just a fraction. She saw it. That moment of doubt? She straightened, giving him no room to regain his arrogance. "You've already crossed a line. You want to see what happens when you cross another." For the first time, he hesitated. Gabrielle's eyes flicked to the navigation panel. The flight path still showed a course for Bermuda. She turned back to him. "Update the route, now." Hayes clenched his jaw, fingers tightening over the controls, but he knew he had lost. With a heavy sigh, he flicked a switch. The screen blinked. The flight path adjusted. The plane was heading back toward London. Gabrielle didn't wait for Hayes to say another word. She turned on her heel and walked out of the cockpit, forcing herself to keep her stride measured, even as adrenaline surged through her veins. The moment she stepped into the cabin, she caught movement near the galley. Jason and Lillian huddled close, whispering in low, urgent tones. The second they saw her, they froze, their expressions shifting into a forced neutrality. But Gabrielle had already seen it. They were nervous. They knew something. She slowed her pace, tilting her head slightly. "Something you'd like to share?" Jason's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Lillian darted a quick glance toward Karen, who stood stiffly by the service counter, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Gabrielle could almost hear the mental calculations happening in real time. Who to align with? Who held the real power? Karen was the first to step forward. "Captain Hayes is the most experienced pilot we have. If he says there's a reason for the diversion, maybe you should trust his judgment." Gabrielle let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Trust? You expect me to trust a man who locked me out of my own cockpit and tried to reroute my plane without my consent?" She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that the weight of it settled over everyone in the cabin. "Tell me, Karen, are you supporting him because you actually believe in his judgment? Or because you don't like the idea of a black woman giving you orders?" The flicker of something on Karen's face, guilt, indignation, both, was all the confirmation Gabrielle needed. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. Sophia moved then, stepping away from the bulkhead where she had been lingering, and Gabrielle caught the shift in her posture. It was subtle, but it was there. The decision, "I didn't know what he was planning," Sophia said quietly, "but I know he's been She hesitated, searching for the right words. Less than professional about your role as the owner. Gabrielle's fingers curled into her palm. Less than professional, she repeated, voice flat. You mean openly racist? Sophia flinched but didn't deny it. Karen scoffed. Oh, come on, let's not make this a race thing. Gabrielle turned to her sharply. It became a race thing the moment Hayes assumed I was a flight attendant instead of the owner of this aircraft. It became a race thing the moment this crew acted like I didn't belong in my own damn jet. And it became a race thing the second you chose to defend him instead of acknowledging what's happening right in front of you. Karen's face flushed a deep red, but she held her ground. I was following protocol. Gabrielle's patience snapped. No, you were following bias, and I don't tolerate either when they work against me. Jason and Lillian shrank back, their eyes darting between Gabrielle and Karen, the growing divide in the crew becoming more apparent with every passing second. Then Jason exhaled heavily and squared his shoulders. I didn't know about the diversion plan, he said quickly, but I heard Hayes saying something before the flight about how he wasn't going to take orders from... He hesitated, casting an uneasy glance at Gabrielle before looking down at his shoes. Gabrielle already knew what he was going to say. Hayes wasn't going to take orders from a black woman. Lillian shifted uncomfortably. I don't want to be involved in whatever this is, she muttered. Gabrielle turned back to Karen. It looks like you're outnumbered. Karen's jaw tightened. She looked at Sophia, at Jason, at Lillian, realizing for the first time that she was standing on sinking ground. Gabrielle could see the battle happening behind her eyes, the instinct to dig in her heels warring with the cold, creeping realization that she had backed the wrong side. But she wasn't ready to surrender yet. She lifted her chin and crossed her arms tighter. You might own this jet, but the captain makes the final call in the air. Gabrielle let out a slow, deliberate breath, then smiled. Not anymore. A sudden jolt rocked the cabin, making the overhead compartments creak and the seatbelt sign flicker on. The turbulence wasn't unexpected. Weather patterns over the Atlantic could be unpredictable, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the usual sharp dips or rolling motions that came with pockets of unstable air. It was erratic, uneven, almost as if... Gabrielle's gaze snapped toward the flight path monitor embedded in the wall near the front of the cabin. She moved quickly, ignoring the uncertain glances from Jason and Lillian as she tapped the screen to bring up their route. Her stomach tightened. They were lagging. Their estimated arrival time had shifted, pushing them back nearly an hour. The jet was still heading toward London, but Hayes had deliberately slowed their speed. A delay. He was stuck. She exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral even as her fingers curled into fists. She turned toward Sophia, who was still standing near the bulkhead, her brows furrowed like she, too, had sensed something was wrong. Gabrielle didn't need to say a word. She just tilted her head slightly toward the cockpit. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded and disappeared through the door. Gabrielle stayed in the main cabin, forcing herself to sit even as her nerves screamed for her to march back into the cockpit and drag Hayes out of his damn seat. She needed proof before she took further action. Karen, who had been silent since their confrontation, finally spoke, her voice edged with something that might have been nervousness. Turbulence is normal over the Atlantic. Gabrielle turned to her with an expression so unreadable it made the other woman falter. I know what turbulence feels like, she said coolly. This isn't it. Karen swallowed, shifting her weight but said nothing. A chime sounded from Gabrielle's laptop, a new email. She opened it, her eyes scanning the message quickly. It was from her corporate office, more specifically, her legal team. Subject, URGENT, unauthorized flight interference. Gabrielle's heartbeat spiked as she clicked into the message. Miss Lawson, we've received multiple inquiries from air traffic control about conflicting reports regarding your flight's status. We were informed that a request was submitted to modify your route due to an emergency, but when we checked with Heathrow's control tower, no such request was approved by your office. We are investigating whether this was a system error or deliberate interference. Please confirm if you authorized this diversion." Her jaw clenched. She typed a quick reply. "I did not authorize any diversion. Investigate immediately." She hit send. Just as Sophia re-emerged from the cockpit, her face tight. She didn't say anything aloud. Instead, she walked straight to Gabrielle and handed her a small slip of paper. Gabrielle unfolded it beneath the table where no one else could see. "He's delaying. Says ATC advised slower speeds due to congestion over London airspace. I checked. That's a lie." Gabrielle's pulse pounded. Sophia had risked her position to get this information. That meant she knew this was wrong. Gabrielle inhaled slowly, keeping her movements deliberate, and then did the one thing she knew would shake them all. She pulled out her phone and, right in front of Karen, Jason, and Lillian, started dialing air traffic control herself. Gabrielle held the phone to her ear, her pulse steady despite the fire burning beneath her skin. The call connected and a clipped British accent answered on the other end. "London Heathrow Air Traffic Control, how can I assist?" "This is Gabrielle Lawson, owner of Gulfstream G700, registration N450GL. I need immediate confirmation of a directive supposedly issued regarding congestion in London airspace." There was a brief pause. "One moment, Miss Lawson." The line filled with the faint clicking of a keyboard. Then, "We have no such advisory on record for your aircraft. Your scheduled arrival window remains unchanged." Gabrielle exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "Understood. Be advised, I suspect unauthorized interference from my flight crew. I am taking control of my aircraft." The operator hesitated. "Would you like us to alert Heathrow security?" Gabrielle's lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. "Yes. Have my security detail on the ground and prepared for an immediate debrief upon landing. And one more thing. Captain Richard Hayes will not be disembarking with my crew." She ended the call and stood, sliding her phone into her pocket. Karen watched with thinly veiled concern, Jason and Lillian outright tense, while Sophia gave the smallest nod, already positioning herself near the cockpit door. Gabrielle smoothed the lapels of her blazer, took a steadying breath, and walked. She didn't knock this time. She simply turned the handle, stepped into the cockpit, and shut the door behind her. Hayes barely glanced at her. "Ms. Lawson, this is a secure area." "Captain Hayes, step away from the controls." His fingers twitched over the throttle. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. You are no longer in command of this flight. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty." The muscles in his jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as his grip on the yoke didn't waver. "You have no authority." Gabrielle took one deliberate step closer, lowering her voice to something sharp, something dangerous. "I have every authority. This is my aircraft, and you are currently in violation of both protocol and direct owner instruction. If you do not remove yourself from this seat, I will personally ensure you never work another flight in your career." He turned then, eyes flashing with something unreadable, anger, disbelief, maybe even the first flicker of fear. Gabrielle arched a brow. "You think this is a bluff? London security has already been notified. The moment we land, you will be escorted off this jet. Your name will be blacklisted from every private aviation staffing agency in the country. If you think your connections will save you, I suggest you reconsider. Because I have more." For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Hayes let go of the controls. He unbuckled his harness, his motions stiff with barely contained rage, and rose from the seat. He turned just enough to glare at Sophia, who refused to meet his gaze before stepping aside. Gabrielle inhaled deeply. Then she looked at Sophia. "Get us to London. No more delays." The jet touched down at London Heathrow with a smooth, precise landing. No turbulence, no sudden course changes, no unnecessary delays. The second the wheels met the tarmac, Gabrielle unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the unspoken rule of waiting until the aircraft had come to a full stop. She had no patience left for decorum. Through the window, she could already see her private security detail stationed near the hangar, waiting just as she had instructed. Hayes hadn't said a word since leaving the cockpit, his shoulders rigid, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. Karen lingered near the galley, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Jason and Lillian had retreated to their usual duties, their eyes careful, guarded, as if afraid that picking the wrong side now would determine their fate. The moment the stairs lowered, Gabrielle stepped off first, the crisp London air slamming into her as if the universe itself wanted to remind her she was no longer in the suffocating presence of Captain Richard Hayes. She strode toward the awaiting black SUV, Sophia falling into step beside her. Hayes, Karen, and the rest of the crew trailed behind, their footsteps heavy with the weight of the moment. The ride to the exclusive five-star hotel in Mayfair was silent. Gabrielle didn't need to speak. Her power filled every inch of the car, pressing against the tension that had built over the last 12 hours. When they arrived, they were escorted to a private executive lounge, a sleek, dimly lit space designed for high-profile negotiations and discreet dealings. It was the kind of place where deals worth billions were signed over whiskey and where powerful men had once underestimated Gabrielle. She stood at the head of the room, arms crossed, her gaze cold and unwavering. "This ends now." Hayes scoffed under his breath, shaking his head, but Gabrielle ignored him. She turned to her private attorney, who had flown in ahead of her. "Is everything prepared?" The attorney nodded. "All documentation is ready per your request." Gabrielle looked directly at Hayes. "You're fired, effective immediately." The room shifted. The air thickened. Karen inhaled sharply. Sophia remained still. Jason and Lillian exchanged nervous glances. Hayes tilted his head, his smirk returning, but this time it wasn't arrogance. It was disbelief. "You serious?" Gabrielle smiled, slow and lethal. "I don't repeat myself." His expression darkened. "You don't have the authority to—" "I have every authority," she cut in smoothly. "This is my aircraft, my company, and I will not employ a man who locked me out of my own cockpit and tried to sabotage my flight." His jaw clenched. He turned slightly to Karen, as if expecting support, but she was too busy trying to sink into her own shadow. Gabrielle's gaze flicked to security, standing at the entrance of the lounge, waiting for her command. "You can leave now, or you can be escorted out." For the first time, Hayes looked truly cornered. His hands curled into fists, but he wasn't stupid. He had lost. He turned on his heel, storming toward the door, his footsteps heavy with rage. When he reached security, he paused just long enough to shoot Gabrielle a look of pure venom. "This isn't over." Gabrielle's lips twitched. "For you, it is?" Hayes disappeared through the doors, his presence leaving a vacuum of tension in the room. Gabrielle turned her attention to Karen. "You encouraged his behavior, and I should fire you for it. But unlike him, you have a choice." She pulled out a written notice of demotion and placed it on the table between them. "Step down as lead flight attendant, or step out completely. Decide now." Karen's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. Her pride was too thick, but her fear was thicker. She swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'll step down." Gabrielle pushed the document toward her. "Sign it." Karen picked up the pen with a shaking hand, signing her name before sliding the paper back. She wouldn't meet Gabrielle's gaze. Gabrielle finally turned to Sophia, whose back was straight, shoulders squared. "You made the right choice," Gabrielle said. "Now let's make it official." She handed Sophia a new contract, one that named her chief pilot, the Abono della Dina. Sophia's breath caught, her fingers hovering over the paper. "Are you sure?" "You earned it," Gabrielle said simply. Sophia signed. Finally, Gabrielle reached for her phone and sent a single text. Moments later, the door opened and a tall man in his mid-40s walked in. His posture was confident, his eyes sharp, and unlike Hayes, his expression carried none of the weight of arrogance. "This is Daniel Reed," Gabrielle announced. "He's your new captain." Daniel extended a hand toward Sophia first. "Looking forward to flying with you." Sophia shook it, something like relief flickering in her eyes. Gabrielle exhaled, her grip on control finally solidified. Hayes was gone. Sophia had taken his place. The crew was no longer divided. Order had been restored. The story exploded before Gabrielle even had time to process the fallout. By the time she returned to her suite, her phone was vibrating nonstop, notifications stacking one after another. Emails from PR, texts from colleagues, missed calls from reporters hungry for a statement. She sighed, sinking into the leather chair by the window, scrolling through the chaos that had erupted online. Black CEO denied access to her own jet. When success isn't enough, billionaire tech mogul faces racial profligacy. At 400,000, Bombardment-induced fire after loss and incident. The hashtags were trending globally. The comments were a mix of outrage, disbelief, and the usual flood of internet trolls minimizing her experience. Some users praised her for standing her ground, calling her a symbol of resilience. Others, predictably, dismissed her as another wealthy person playing the victim. But the conversation was happening, and it was bigger than just her. Her PR director had already drafted a formal statement, something measured, corporate, polished. But Gabrielle wasn't in the mood for safe. She wanted truth. She tapped out a response, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "If I can't board my own jet without suspicion, imagine how others are treated daily. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that questions who belongs, even when the answer is undeniable. Bias in elite spaces is real, and today I made it clear. I will not be erased from my own success." She hit send. The response was immediate. Thousands of retweets, thousands of shares. Celebrities, activists, and business leaders weighed in, turning the story from a personal incident into a broader conversation about race, wealth, and power. Some called for industry-wide changes in private aviation. Others demanded statements from flight staffing agencies. Gabrielle leaned back, rubbing her temples. She hadn't wanted to be a headline. She hadn't wanted to be a symbol, but if this was the fight, then she would own it. A week later, a formal apology arrived from the staffing agency. It was carefully worded, laced with corporate jargon about miscommunication and a commitment to diversity, but Gabrielle barely skimmed it. Words were cheap. Actions were what mattered, and she had already taken hers. Weeks later, Gabrielle walked across the private tarmac once more, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the sleek frame of her Gulfstream G700 Dot. This time, there were no lingering stares, no questions, no hesitation. Daniel Reed, her new captain, stood at the base of the air stairs, offering a polite nod as she approached. "Welcome aboard, Miss Lawson." Sophia was already inside, finalizing pre-glee checks, now fully in command as chief pilot. Jason and Lillian stood near the cabin entrance, their postures professional but relaxed. Karen was gone, replaced by a new lead flight attendant, one who greeted her with respect, not skepticism. Gabrielle stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of polished leather and fresh coffee, her coffee, waiting for her on the side table just as it should be. She set down her bag, letting herself sink into her seat. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly toward the horizon. She gazed at them for a long moment, a quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. "I own this plane, and no one will ever deny me again." Gabrielle leaned back in her seat, watching as the plane ascended higher into the sky, the world below growing smaller and smaller. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a moment of peace, but in the back of her mind the question lingered, not just for her, but for anyone who's ever been made to feel less than because of their race, gender, or background. What would you do if you were denied access to something you rightfully owned? Imagine stepping into a space where you belong, a place you've earned and worked tirelessly for, only to have someone question your right to be there, whether it's a job, a seat at a table, or even something as personal as your own jet. What would you do when someone dares to challenge your place? You ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for yourself? A moment where you felt the weight of judgment, prejudice, or doubt pressing against you, and you knew that your only choice was to fight back? Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you? These are the moments that define us, that push us to stand taller, speak louder, and take back the power that was never theirs to begin with. And as Gabrielle sat there, her eyes fixed on the clouds outside, she felt that power coursing through her once again. She had faced the very forces that tried to hold her back, that tried to label her as an imposter in her own success. And she had won. Her respect isn't given, it's taken. If they don't let you in, take the keys and open the damn door yourself. Sometimes, the world won't hand you the seat you deserve. Sometimes you have to make your own space, take what's rightfully yours, and show them exactly who's in charge. Let them know who's in charge. Take your place, take your power, because no one can deny you entry when you've already proven you belong. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every time we speak up, every time we take a stand, we push the world forward. This isn't just Gabrielle's story. It's a reality that countless people face every day. But change starts when we refuse to stay silent, when we demand the respect we deserve. Together, we can create a world where no one has to prove they belong, where success isn't questioned, and where dignity is recognized and respected. Your voice matters, your presence matters, and no one has the right to take that away from you. Keep pushing forward, keep taking up space, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong, because you do.